Tam Itam followed his master to the landing stage outside the fort. The night was clear, but without a moon, and the middle of the river was dark, while the water under each bank reflected the light of many fires, as on a night of Ramadan. Tam Itam said. Warboats drifted silently in the dark lane, or anchored, floated motionless with a loud ripple. That night there was much paddling in a canoe and walking at his master's heels for Tam Itam. Up and down the street they tramped, where the fires were burning, inland on the outskirts of the town, where small parties of men kept guard in the fields. Tuan Jim gave his orders and was obeyed. Last of all they went to the Raja's stockade, which a detachment of Jim's people manned on that night. The old Raja had fled early in the morning with most of his women to a small house he had near a jungle village on a tributary stream. Qasim, left behind, had attended the council with his air of diligent activity to explain away the diplomacy of the day before. He was considerably cold-shouldered, but managed to preserve his smiling, quiet alertness, and professed himself highly delighted when Jim told him sternly that he proposed to occupy the stockade on that night with his own men. After the council broke up, he was heard outside accosting this and that deputing chief, and speaking in a loud, gratified tone of the Raja's property being protected in the Raja's absence. About 10 or so Jim's men marched in. The stockade commanded the mouth of the creek, and Jim meant to remain there till Brown had passed below. A small fire was lit on the flat, grassy point outside the wall of stakes, and Tam Itam placed a little folding stool for his master. Jim told him to try and sleep. Tam Itam got a mat and lay down a little way off, but he could not sleep, though he knew he had to go on an important journey before the night was out. His master walked to and fro before the fire with bowed head and with his hands behind his back. His face was sad. Whenever his master approached him, Tam Itam pretended to sleep, not wishing his master to know he had been watched. At last his master stood still, looking down on him as he lay, and said softly, "It is time." Tam Itam arose directly and made his preparations. His mission was to go down the river, preceding Brown's boat by an hour or more, to tell Dane Werris finally and formally that the whites were to be allowed to pass out unmolested. Jim would not trust anybody else with that service. Before starting, Tam Itam, more as a matter of form, since his position about Jim made him perfectly known, asked for a token. "Because, Tuan," he said, "the message is important, and these are thy very words I carry." His master first put his hand into one pocket, then into another, and finally took off his forefinger Stein's silver ring, which he habitually wore, and gave it to Tam Itam. When Tam Itam left on his mission, Brown's camp on the knoll was dark, but for a single small glow shining through the branches of one of the trees the white men had cut down. Early in the evening Brown had received from Jim a folded piece of paper on which was written, "You get the clear road. Start as soon as your boat floats on the morning tide. Let your men be careful. The bushes on both sides of the creek and the stockade at the mouth are full of well-armed men. You would have no chance, but I don't believe you want bloodshed." Brown read it, tore the paper into small pieces, and turning to Cornelius, who had brought it, said jeeringly, "Goodbye, my excellent friend." Cornelius had been in the fort and had been sneaking around Jim's house during the afternoon. Jim chose him to carry the note because he could speak English, was known to Brown, and was not likely to be shot by some nervous mistake of one of the men as a Malay, approaching in the dusk, perhaps might have been. Cornelius didn't go away after delivering the paper. Brown was sitting up over a tiny fire, all the others were lying down. "I could tell you something you would like to know," Cornelius mumbled crossly. Brown paid no attention. "You did not kill him," went on the other, "and what do you get for it? You might have had money from the Raja, besides the loot of all the Bugis houses, and now you get nothing." "You had better clear out from here," growled Brown, without even looking at him. But Cornelius let himself drop by his side and began to whisper very fast, touching his elbow from time to time. What he had to say made Brown sit up at first, with a curse. He had simply informed him of Dane Werris's armed party down the river. At first Brown saw himself completely sold and betrayed, but a moment's reflection convinced him that there could be no treachery intended. He said nothing, and after a while Cornelius remarked, in a tone of complete indifference, that there was another way out of the river which he knew very well. "A good thing to know, too," said Brown, pricking up his ears, and Cornelius began to talk of what went on in town and repeated all that had been said in council. gossiping in an even undertone at Brown's ear as you talk amongst sleeping men you do not wish to wake. He thinks he has made me harmless, does he? Mumbled Brown very low. Yes, he is a fool, a little child. He came here and robbed me, droned on Cornelius, and he made all the people believe him. But if something happened that they did not believe him any more, where would he be? And the Bugis Dane, who is waiting for you down the river there, Captain, is the very man who chased you up here when you first came. Brown observed nonchalantly that it would be just as well to avoid him, and with the same detached, musing air Cornelius declared himself acquainted with a backwater broad enough to take Brown's boat past Werris's camp. You will have to be quiet, he said as an afterthought, for in one place we pass close behind his camp, very close. They are camped ashore with their boats hauled up. Oh, we know how to be as quiet as mice. Never fear, said Brown. Cornelius stipulated that in case he were to pilot Brown out, his canoe should be towed. I'll have to get back quick, he explained. It was 2 hours before the dawn when word was passed to the stockade from outlying watchers that the white robbers were coming down to their boat. In a very short time, every armed man from one end of Patusan to the other was on the alert, yet the banks of the river remained so silent that, but for the fires burning with sudden blurred flares, the town might have been asleep as if in peacetime. A heavy mist lay very low on the water, making a sort of elusive grey light that showed nothing. When Brown's longboat glided out of the creek into the river, Jim was standing on the low point of land before the Rajah's stockade, on the very spot where for the first time he put his foot on Patusan shore. A shadow loomed up, moving in the greyness, solitary, very bulky, and yet constantly eluding the eye. A murmur of low talking came out of it. Brown at the tiller heard Jim speak calmly. A clear road. You had better trust to the current while the fog lasts, but this will lift presently. Yes, presently we shall see clear, replied Brown. The 30 or 40 men standing with muskets at ready outside the stockade held their breath. The Bugis owner of the prow, whom I saw on Stein's veranda and who was amongst them, told me that the boat, shaving the low point close, seemed for a moment to grow big and hang over it like a mountain. If you think it worth your while to wait a day outside, called out Jim, I'll try to send you down something, a bullock, some yams, what I can. The shadow went on moving. Yes, do, said a voice, blank and muffled out of the fog. Not one of the many attentive listeners understood what the words meant. And then Brown and his men in their boat floated away, fading spectrally without the slightest sound. Thus Brown, invisible in the mist, goes out of Patusan elbow to elbow with Cornelius in the stern sheets of the longboat. Perhaps you shall get a small bullock, said Cornelius. Oh yes, bullock, yam, you'll get it if he said so. He always speaks the truth. He stole everything I had. I suppose you like a small bullock better than the loot of many houses. I would advise you to hold your tongue, or somebody here may fling you overboard into this damned fog, said Brown. The boat seemed to be standing still. Nothing could be seen, not even the river alongside. Only the water dust flew and trickled, condensed, down their beards and faces. It was weird, Brown told me. Every individual man of them felt as though he were adrift alone in a boat, haunted by an almost imperceptible suspicion of sighing, muttering ghosts. Throw me out, would you? But I would know where I was, mumbled Cornelius surlily. I've lived many years here. Not long enough to see through a fog like this, Brown said, lolling back with his arms swinging to and fro on the useless tiller. Yes, long enough for that, snarled Cornelius. That's very useful, commented Brown. Am I to believe you could find that back way you spoke of blindfold like this? Cornelius grunted. Are you too tired to row? He asked after a silence. No, by God, shouted Brown suddenly. Out with your oars there. There was a great knocking in the fog, which after a while settled into a regular grind of invisible sweeps against invisible thole pins. Otherwise nothing was changed, and but for the slight splash of a dipped blade, it was like rowing a balloon car in a cloud, said Brown. Thereafter Cornelius did not open his lips, except to ask querulously for somebody to bail out his canoe, which was towing behind the longboat. Gradually the fog whitened and became luminous ahead. To the left Brown saw a darkness as though he had been looking at the back of the departing night. All at once, a big bough covered with leaves appeared above his head, and ends of twigs, dripping and still, curved slenderly close alongside. Cornelius, without a word, took the tiller from his hand. Chapter 44. I don't think they spoke together again. The boat entered a narrow by-channel, where it was pushed by the oar blades set into crumbling banks, and there was a gloom as if enormous black wings had been outspread above the mist that filled its depth to the summits of the trees. The branches overhead showered big drops through the gloomy fog. At a mutter from Cornelius, Brown ordered his men to load. "I'll give you a chance to get even with them before we're done, you dismal cripples, you," he said to his gang. "Mind you don't throw it away, you hounds." Low growls answered that speech. Cornelius showed much fussy concern for the safety of his canoe. Meantime Tam Itam had reached the end of his journey. The fog had delayed him a little, but he had paddled steadily, keeping in touch with the south bank. By and by daylight came like a glow in a ground glass globe. The shores made on each side of the river a dark smudge, in which one could detect hints of columnar forms and shadows of twisted branches high up. The mist was still thick on the water, but a good watch was being kept, for as Itam approached the camp, the figures of two men emerged out of the white vapor, and voices spoke to him boisterously. He answered, and presently a canoe lay alongside, and he exchanged news with the paddlers. All was well. The trouble was over. Then the men in the canoe let go their grip on the side of his dugout and incontinently fell out of sight. He pursued his way till he heard voices coming to him quietly over the water, and saw, under the now lifting, swirling mist, the glow of many little fires burning on a sandy stretch, backed by lofty, thin timber and bushes. There again a lookout was kept, for he was challenged. He shouted his name as the two last sweeps of his paddle ran his canoe up on the strand. It was a big camp. Men crouched in many little knots under a subdued murmur of early morning talk. Many thin threads of smoke curled slowly on the white mist. Little shelters, elevated above the ground, had been built for the chiefs. Muskets were stacked in small pyramids, and long spears were stuck singly into the sand near the fires. Tam Itam, assuming an air of importance, demanded to be led to Dane Werris. He found the friend of his white lord lying on a raised couch made of bamboo and sheltered by a sort of shed of sticks covered with mats. Dane Werris was awake, and a bright fire was burning before his sleeping place, which resembled a rude shrine. The only son of Nakhoda Doramin answered his greeting kindly. Tam Itam began by handing him the ring which vouched for the truth of the messenger's words. Dane Werris, reclining on his elbow, bade him speak and tell all the news. Beginning with the consecrated formula, "The news is good," Tam Itam delivered Jim's own words. The white men, deputing with the consent of all the chiefs, were to be allowed to pass down the river. In answer to a question or two, Tam Itam then reported the proceedings of the last council. Dane Werris listened attentively to the end, toying with the ring which ultimately he slipped on the forefinger of his right hand. After hearing all he had to say, he dismissed Tam Itam to have food and rest. Orders for the return in the afternoon were given immediately. Afterwards, Dane Werris lay down again, open-eyed, while his personal attendants were preparing his food at the fire, by which Tam Itam also sat talking to the men who lounged up to hear the latest intelligence from the town. The sun was eating up the mist. A good watch was kept upon the reach of the main stream, where the boat of the whites was expected to appear every moment. It was then that Brown took his revenge upon the world, which, after 20 years of contemptuous and reckless bullying, refused him the tribute of a common robber's success. It was an act of cold-blooded ferocity, and it consoled him on his deathbed like a memory of an indomitable defiance. Stealthily, he landed his men on the other side of the island opposite to the Bugis camp and led them across. After a short but quite silent scuffle, Cornelius, who had tried to slink away at the moment of landing, resigned himself to show the way where the undergrowth was most sparse. Brown held both his skinny hands together behind his back in the grip of one vast fist, and now and then impelled him forward with a fierce push. Cornelius remained as mute as a fish, abject but faithful to his purpose, whose accomplishment loomed before him dimly. At the edge of the patch of forest, Brown's men spread themselves out in cover and waited. The camp was plain from end to end before their eyes, and no one looked their way. Nobody even dreamed that the white men could have any knowledge of the narrow channel at the back of the island. When he judged the moment come, Brown yelled, "Let them have it," and 14 shots rang out like one. Tam Itam told me the surprise was so great that, except for those who fell dead or wounded, not a soul of them moved for quite an appreciable time after the first discharge. Then a man screamed, and after that scream, A great yell of amazement and fear went up from all the throats. A blind panic drove these men in a surging, swaying mob to and fro along the shore like a herd of cattle afraid of the water. Some few jumped into the river then, but most of them did so only after the last discharge. 3 times Brown's men fired into the ruck. Brown, the only one in view, cursing and yelling, "Aim low, aim low." Tam Itam says that, as for him, he understood at the first volley what had happened. Though untouched, he fell down and lay as if dead, but with his eyes open. At the sound of the first shots, Dane Werris, reclining on the couch, jumped up and ran out upon the open shore, just in time to receive a bullet in his forehead at the second discharge. Tam Itam saw him fling his arms wide open before he fell. Then, he says, a great fear came upon him, not before. The white men retired as they had come, unseen. Thus Brown balanced his account with the evil fortune. Notice that even in this awful outbreak, there is a superiority as of a man who carries right, the abstract thing, within the envelope of his common desires. It was not a vulgar and treacherous massacre. It was a lesson, a retribution, a demonstration of some obscure and awful attribute of our nature which, I am afraid, is not so very far under the surface as we like to think. Afterwards the whites depart unseen by Tam Itam and seem to vanish from before men's eyes altogether, and the schooner, too, vanishes after the manner of stolen goods. But a story is told of a white longboat picked up a month later in the Indian Ocean by a cargo steamer. 2 parched, yellow, glassy-eyed, whispering skeletons in her recognized the authority of a third, who declared that his name was Brown. His schooner, he reported, bound south with a cargo of Java sugar, had sprung a bad leak and sank under his feet. He and his companions were the survivors of a crew of 6. The 2 died on board the steamer, which rescued them. Brown lived to be seen by me, and I can testify that he had played his part to the last. It seems, however, that in going away they had neglected to cast off Cornelius's canoe. Cornelius himself Brown had let go at the beginning of the shooting, with a kick for a parting benediction. Tam Itam, after arising from amongst the dead, saw the Nazarene running up and down the shore amongst the corpses and the expiring fires. He uttered little cries. Suddenly he rushed to the water and made frantic efforts to get one of the Bugis boats into the water. Afterwards, till he had seen me, related Tam Itam, he stood looking at the heavy canoe and scratching his head. What became of him? I asked. Tam Itam, staring hard at me, made an expressive gesture with his right arm. Twice I struck Tuan, he said. When he beheld me approaching, he cast himself violently on the ground and made a great outcry, kicking. He screeched like a frightened hen till he felt the point. Then he was still, and lay staring at me, while his life went out of his eyes. This done, Tam Itam did not tarry. He understood the importance of being the first with the awful news at the fort. There were, of course, many survivors of Dane Werris's party, but in the extremity of panic some had swum across the river, others had bolted into the bush. The fact is that they did not know really who struck that blow, whether more white robbers were not coming, whether they had not already got hold of the whole land. They imagined themselves to be the victims of a vast treachery and utterly doomed to destruction. It is said that some small parties did not come in till 3 days afterwards. However, a few tried to make their way back to Patusan at once, and one of the canoes that were patrolling the river that morning was in sight of the camp at the very moment of the attack. It is true that at first the men in her leaped overboard and swam to the opposite bank, but afterwards they returned to their boat and started fearfully upstream. Of these Tam Itam had an hour's advance. Chapter 45. When Tam Itam, paddling madly, came into the town reach, the women, thronging the platforms before the houses, were looking out for the return of Dane Werris's little fleet of boats. The town had a festive air. Here and there men, still with spears or guns in their hands, could be seen moving or standing on the shore in groups. Chinamen's shops had been opened early, but the marketplace was empty, and a sentry, still posted at the corner of the fort, made out Tam Itam and shouted to those within. The gate was wide open. Tam Itam jumped ashore and ran in headlong. The first person he met was the girl coming down from the house. Tam Itam, disordered, panting, with trembling lips and wild eyes, stood for a time before her as if a sudden spell had been laid on him. Then he broke out very quickly, "They have killed Dane Werris and many more." She clapped her hands, and her first words were, "Shut the gates." Most of the fortmen had gone back to their houses, but Tam Itam hurried on the few who remained for their turn of duty within. The girl stood in the middle of the courtyard while the others ran about. "Doramin," she cried despairingly as Tam Itam passed her. Next time he went by he answered her thought rapidly, "Yes, but we have all the powder in Patusan." She caught him by the arm and pointing at the house, "Call him out," she whispered, trembling. Tam Itam ran up the steps. His master was sleeping. "It is I, Tam Itam," he cried at the door, with tidings that cannot wait. He saw Jim turn over on the pillow and open his eyes, and he burst out at once. "This, Tuan, is a day of evil, an accursed day." His master raised himself on his elbow to listen, just as Dane Werris had done. And then Tam Itam began his tale, trying to relate the story in order, calling Dane Werris Panglima and saying, "The Panglima then called out to the chief of his own boatmen, 'Give Tam Itam something to eat.' When his master put his feet to the ground and looked at him with such a discomposed face that the words remained in his throat. 'Speak out,' said Jim. 'Is he dead?' 'May you live long,' cried Tam Itam. It was a most cruel treachery. He ran out at the first shots and fell. His master walked to the window and with his fist struck at the shutter. The room was made light, and then in a steady voice, but speaking fast, he began to give him orders to assemble a fleet of boats for immediate pursuit, go to this man, to the other, send messengers. And as he talked, he sat down on the bed, stooping to lace his boots hurriedly, and suddenly looked up. "Why do you stand here?" he asked, very red-faced. "Waste no time." Tam Itam did not move. "Forgive me, Tuan, but he began to stammer. "What?" cried his master aloud, looking terrible, leaning forward with his hands gripping the edge of the bed. "It is not safe for thy servant to go out amongst the people," said Tam Itam, after hesitating a moment. Then Jim understood. He had retreated from one world, for a small matter of an impulsive jump, and now the other, the work of his own hands, had fallen in ruins upon his head. It was not safe for his servant to go out amongst his own people. I believe that in that very moment he had decided to defy the disaster in the only way it occurred to him such a disaster could be defied. But all I know is that, without a word, he came out of his room and sat before the long table, at the head of which he was accustomed to regulate the affairs of his world, proclaiming daily the truth that surely lived in his heart. The dark powers should not rob him twice of his peace. He sat like a stone figure. Tam Itam, deferential, hinted at preparations for defense. The girl he loved came in and spoke to him, but he made a sign with his hand, and she was awed by the dumb appeal for silence in it. She went out on the veranda and sat on the threshold, as if to guard him with her body from dangers outside. What thoughts passed through his head, what memories, who can tell? Everything was gone, and he who had been once unfaithful to his trust had lost again all men's confidence. It was then, I believe, he tried to write to somebody and gave it up. Loneliness was closing on him. People had trusted him with their lives only for that, and yet they could never, as he had said, never be made to understand him. Those without did not hear him make a sound. Later, towards the evening, he came to the door and called for Tam Itam. "Well," he asked, "there is much weeping, much anger too," said Tam Itam. Jim looked up at him. "You know," he murmured. "Yes, Tuan," said Tam Itam. "Thy servant does know, and the gates are closed. We shall have to fight." "Fight what for?" he asked. "For our lives." "I have no life," he said. Tam Itam heard a cry from the girl at the door. "Who knows?" said Tam Itam. "By audacity and cunning we may even escape. There is much fear in men's hearts too." He went out, thinking vaguely of boats and of open sea, leaving Jim and the girl together. I haven't the heart to set down here such glimpses as she had given me of the hour or more she passed in there wrestling with him for the possession of her happiness. Whether he had any hope, what he expected, what he imagined, it is impossible to say. He was inflexible, and with the growing loneliness of his obstinacy, his spirit seemed to rise above the ruins of his existence. She cried, "Fight!" into his ear. She could not understand. There was nothing to fight for. He was going to prove his power in another way and conquer the fatal destiny itself. He came out into the courtyard, and behind him, with streaming hair, wild of face, breathless, she staggered out and leaned on the side of the doorway. "Open the gates," he ordered. Afterwards, turning to those of his men who were inside, he gave them leave to depart to their homes. "For how long, Tuan?" asked one of them timidly. "For all life," he said in a somber tone. A hush had fallen upon the town, after the outburst of wailing and lamentation that had swept over the river, like a gust of wind from the opened abode of sorrow. But rumors flew in whispers, filling the hearts with consternation and horrible doubts. The robbers were coming back, bringing many others with them in a great ship, and there would be no refuge in the land for anyone. A sense of utter insecurity, as during an earthquake, pervaded the minds of men, who whispered their suspicions, looking at each other as if in the presence of some awful portent. The sun was sinking towards the forests when Dane Werris's body was brought into Doramin's campung. 4 men carried it in, covered decently with a white sheet, which the old mother had sent out down to the gate to meet her son on his return. They laid him at Doramin's feet, and the old man sat still for a long time, one hand on each knee, looking down. The fronds of palms swayed gently, and the foliage of fruit trees stirred above his head. Every single man of his people was there, fully armed, when the old Nakhoda at last raised his eyes. He moved them slowly over the crowd, as if seeking for a missing face. Again his chin sank on his breast. The whispers of many men mingled with the slight rustling of the leaves. The Malay who had brought Tam, Item, and the girl to Samarang was there too. "Not so angry as many," he said to me, but struck with a great awe and wonder at the suddenness of men's fate, which hangs over their heads like a cloud charged with thunder. He told me that when Dane Werris's body was uncovered at a sign of Doramin, he whom they often called the White Lord's friend, was disclosed lying unchanged with his eyelids a little open as if about to wake. Doramin leaned forward a little more, like one looking for something fallen on the ground. His eyes searched the body from its feet to its head, for the wound maybe. It was in the forehead and small, and there was no word spoken while one of the bystanders, stooping, took off the silver ring from the cold, stiff hand. In silence, he held it up before Doramin. A murmur of dismay and horror ran through the crowd at the sight of that familiar token. The old Nakhoda stared at it, and suddenly let out one great fierce cry, deep from the chest, a roar of pain and fury, as mighty as the bellow of a wounded bull, bringing great fear into men's hearts, by the magnitude of his anger and his sorrow that could be plainly discerned without words. There was a great stillness afterwards for space, while the body was being borne aside by 4 men. They laid it down under a tree, and on the instant, with one long shriek, all the women of the household began to wail together. They mourned with shrill cries. The sun was setting, and in the intervals of screamed lamentations, the high sing-song voices of 2 old men intoning the Quran chanted alone. About this time Jim, leaning on a gun carriage, looked at the river and turned his back on the house, and the girl in the doorway, panting as if she had run herself to a standstill, was looking at him across the yard. Tam Itam stood not far from his master, waiting patiently for what might happen. All at once Jim, who seemed to be lost in quiet thought, turned to him and said, "Time to finish this." "Tuan," said Tam Itam, advancing with alacrity. He did not know what his master meant, but as soon as Jim made a movement, the girl started too and walked down into the open space. It seems that no one else of the people of the house was in sight. She tottered slightly, and about halfway down called out to Jim, who had apparently resumed his peaceful contemplation of the river. He turned round, setting his back against the gun. "Will you fight?" she cried. "There is nothing to fight for," he said. "Nothing is lost." Saying this, he made a step towards her. "Will you fly?" she cried again. "There is no escape," he said, stopping short, and she stood still also, silent, devouring him with her eyes. "And you shall go," she said slowly. He bent his head. "Ah," she exclaimed, peering at him as it were, "you are mad or false. Do you remember the night I prayed you to leave me, and you said that you could not, that it was impossible, impossible? Do you remember you said you would never leave me? Why, I asked you for no promise. You promised unasked, remember." "Enough, poor girl," he said. "I should not be worth having." Tam Itam said that while they were talking she would laugh loud and senselessly like one under the visitation of God. His master put his hands to his head. He was fully dressed as for every day, but without a hat. She stopped laughing suddenly. "For the last time," she cried menacingly, "will you defend yourself?" "Nothing can touch me," he said in a last flicker of superb egoism. Tam Itam saw her lean forward where she stood, open her arms, and run at him swiftly. She flung herself upon his breast, and clasped him round the neck. "Ah, but I shall hold thee thus," she cried. "Thou art mine." She sobbed on his shoulder. The sky over Patusan was blood-red, immense, streaming like an open vein. An enormous sun nestled crimson amongst the tree-tops, and the forest below had a black and forbidding face. Tam Itam tells me that on that evening the aspect of the heavens was angry and frightful. I may well believe it, for I know that on that very day a cyclone passed within 60 miles of the coast, though there was hardly more than a languid stir of air in the place. Suddenly Tam Itam saw Jim catch her arms, trying to unclasp her hands. She hung on them with her head fallen back, her hair touched the ground. "Come here," his master called, and Tam Itam helped to ease her down. It was difficult to separate her fingers. Jim, bending over her, looked earnestly upon her face, and all at once ran to the landing stage. Tam Itam followed him, but turning his head, he saw that she had struggled up to her feet. She ran after them a few steps, then fell down heavily on her knees. "Tuan, Tuan," called Tam Itam, "look back," but Jim was already in a canoe, standing up, paddle in hand. He did not look back. Tam Itam had just time to scramble in after him when the canoe floated clear. The girl was then on her knees, with clasped hands, at the watergate. She remained thus for a time in a supplicating attitude before she sprang up. "You are false," she screamed out after Jim. "Forgive me," he cried. "Never, never," she called back. Tam Itam took the paddle from Jim's hands, it being unseemly that he should sit while his lord paddled. When they reached the other shore, his master forbade him to come any farther, but Tam Itam did follow him at a distance, walking up the slope to Doramin's campong. It was beginning to grow dark. Torches twinkled here and there. Those they met seemed awestruck and stood aside hastily to let Jim pass. The wailing of women came from above. The courtyard was full of armed Bugis with their followers and of Patusan people. I do not know what this gathering really meant. Were these preparations for war, or for vengeance, or to repulse a threatened invasion? Many days elapsed before the people had ceased to look out, quaking, for the return of the white men with long beards and in rags, whose exact relation to their own white man they could never understand. Even for those simple minds, poor Jim remains under a cloud. Doramin alone, immense and desolate, sat in his armchair with the pair of flintlock pistols on his knees, faced by an armed throng. When Jim appeared, at somebody's exclamation, all the heads turned round together, and then the mass opened right and left, and he walked up a lane of averted glances. Whispers followed him, murmurs, "He has worked all the evil. He hath a charm." He heard them, perhaps. When he came up into the light of torches, the wailing of the women ceased suddenly. Doramin did not lift his head, and Jim stood silent before him for a time. Then he looked to the left, and moved in that direction with measured steps. Dane Werris's mother crouched at the head of the body, and the grey, disheveled hair concealed her face. Jim came up slowly, looked at his dead friend, lifting the sheet, then dropped it without a word. Slowly he walked back. He came, was running from lip to lip, making a murmur to which he moved. "He hath taken it upon his own head," a voice said aloud. He heard this and turned to the crowd. "Yes, upon my head." A few people recoiled. Jim waited a while before Doramin, and then said gently, "I am come in sorrow." He waited again. "I am come ready and unarmed," he repeated. The unwieldy old man, lowering his big forehead like an ox under a yoke, made an effort to rise, clutching at the flintlock pistols on his knees. From his throat came gurgling, choking, inhuman sounds, and his two attendants helped him from behind. People remarked that the ring which he had dropped on his lap fell and rolled against the foot of the white man, and that poor Jim glanced down at the talisman that had opened for him the door of fame, love, and success, within the wall of forests fringed with white foam, within the coast that under the western sun looks like the very stronghold of the night. Doramin, struggling to keep his feet, made with his two supporters a swaying, tottering group. His little eyes stared with an expression of mad pain, of rage, with a ferocious glitter which the bystanders noticed. And then, while Jim stood stiffened and with bared head in the light of torches, looking him straight in the face, he clung heavily with his left arm round the neck of a bowed youth, and lifting deliberately his right, shot his son's friend through the chest. The crowd, which had fallen apart behind Jim as soon as Doramin had raised his hand, rushed tumultuously forward after the shot. They say that the white man sent right and left at all those faces a proud and unflinching glance. Then, with his hand over his lips, he fell forward, dead. And that's the end. He passes away under a cloud, inscrutable at heart, forgotten, unforgiven, and excessively romantic. Not in the wildest days of his boyish visions could he have seen the alluring shape of such an extraordinary success. For it may very well be that in the short moment of his last proud and unflinching glance, he had beheld the face of that opportunity which, like an Eastern bride, had come veiled to his side. But we can see him, an obscure conqueror of fame, tearing himself out of the arms of a jealous love at the sign, at the call of his exalted egoism. He goes away from a living woman to celebrate his pitiless wedding with a shadowy ideal of conduct. Is he satisfied? Quite now, I wonder. We ought to know. He is one of us, and have I not stood up once, like an evoked ghost, to answer for his eternal constancy? Was I so very wrong after all? Now he is no more. There are days when the reality of his existence comes to me with an overwhelming force. And yet upon my honor there are moments, too, when he passes from my eyes like a disembodied spirit astray amongst the passions of this earth, ready to surrender himself faithfully to the claim of his own world of shades. Who knows? He is gone, inscrutable at heart, and the poor girl is leading a sort of soundless, inert life in Stein's house. Stein has aged greatly of late. He feels it himself, and says often that he is preparing to leave all this, preparing to leave, while he waves his hand sadly at his butterflies. September 1899, July 1900.